What's the cheapest dining table you could build? No, really. Could we beat IKEA in price by making it ourselves? Or has it come to a point where materials are so expensive we can't? At the end, I'll do a comparison to see if I could actually do it. I have to make a table to seat 30 people for a party that we're having in less than a week. So how cheaply can we actually do it? And of course, I have some cool 3D prints for this project because there is something I think every table should have that you can make yourself. I'll keep track of costs and then we can probably argue in the comments about better and cheaper alternatives. This video is sponsored by PCBWay. I wanted the table to consist of a couple of parts. I wanted it to be of good quality. I mean, if you want to make it really cheap, you can just make it out of any cheap wood you can find or pallets and be happy with it. But I wanted this table to last and look good as well. So if you're up for the challenge, try to make it cheaper than me and tag me on Instagram if you want me to share it. From researching materials, I decided on making a tabletop out of, and hold on to your hat, that's a common Swedish saying translated by the way, it's to say brace yourself, glue-jointed pine. This is mainly sold to be used for shelving, but the sheets come in lengths of 2.4 meters, which would make for a long dining table. The ones I found are 27 millimeters thick, which means it would be good enough, and since they are made for shelving, they come in widths up to 60 centimeters. Although that could work as a table, I want people to have some kind of room at the table, so I decided to go with the 40 centimeter wide shelves and do 2 of them for each table with a small gap in the middle. For the legs, I drew up a table that I think looked good and would be easy to make with the materials from the local store. But there was one really big flaw in my design that forced me to do a lot more work than I initially had prepared for. This will be made with construction lumber as it's cheaply and readily available. And yes, not the best wood in the world for a table, but it will probably hold up really well. Only problem for me was I had to make 3 of them in less than a week. This is the room the tables are going into. It's not really a room, it's a barn, and it's been used for storing hay. We've already built a staircase to be able to get up here, and we have the chairs that will go around the tables. Since we have a lot of other things to do here before we can host a party, I needed to work on the tables whilst my wife kept working on everything else in there. Since the tabletops were basically already finished, I could focus on the base right away. And since I already had a design, I just went with that. After carrying all my material up the stairs, I was ready to start working on the wood. But I also had to carry all the tools up there. And let me tell you, this miter saw is heavy as... You might have already seen I had a miter saw there, but that's a pro machine. It's not for me to use. I could have made the tables somewhere else, but going up there, making the tables in location they were going in just felt nice, and also they would be quite big and hard to carry up there after the fact. This is one of those builds that gives me purpose. I could just have bought a couple of tables or borrowed them from people, but I want to be able to use this place for more events in the future, and having this room available with furniture makes a lot of sense. In 3 weeks' time, I would also be hosting a maker meetup for the patrons of the podcast me and Steve Bell Creates make, so that the tables would serve multiple purposes. But there is something around the purpose of it all that has caught my interest in the last couple of weeks, because I find that a lot of people live their lives without a hobby, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. It's just my nightmare. Because I think I've been there in some sense. I remember a time when I didn't know what to do with my time. I was more or less just scrambling around, doing bits and pieces of everything. It wasn't that I didn't have a hobby, but my hobbies didn't have a purpose back then. When it comes to a project like this, I have created a purpose because we invited a bunch of people to come here and have a party with us before we even had any place to have a party at or even the furniture. And the purpose gives me energy and meaning to do my hobby. And when I feel that extreme joy in making, I get up early in the morning because I want to get as much out of the day as possible to do what I love. Anyway, maybe you can relate. In that case, let me know what you think about the subject in the comments. I really find it interesting. You've seen me cut the pieces to length in various angles on the miter saw, and if you want to make this table, don't sweat it. I'll have plans available on my website along with the materials list. And when cutting all sorts of angles, I have a digital protractor that helps a lot. I did consider a couple of options for attaching the table together. Wood glue is the strongest, so that's what I went with, but I also decided to add screws to make my life easier. So for every screw, I also drilled a hole for a dowel. It's just a way of covering up those screw holes later. Since I was doing 3 tables, I worked in shifts, trying to make sure I always had something in glue and something to work on. And I was good on time at this point. Gathering the materials took half a day. I had to go to 2 different locations to get them, and the drive was quite long, but once I could get started building, I was in a flow. One piece after another. It did help that I had a CAD model to work from with the angles I had to cut, and setting the angle on the Festool table saw is just pure happiness. I'm not sure you can relate to this, but there's always been a small hindrance for me to get started. I postponed the start for what I think is insecurity. It's like I need to run the build through my head one more time before I actually get to it. But I have noticed that the more experience I get, the less time I spend in that pre-state, the running it through my head phase. Like I said, I had measurements, but that's not always what I go with. I did cut the long pieces that runs underneath the table to connect the legs before I had the other long stretchers that go on the top cut. And I did cut that first one bit shorter than the model, which meant I didn't want to cut the other stretchers to length either. So I decided to attach the bottom stretchers first, then get the measurements to cut the others. And that worked a charm. I couldn't attach the top stretchers the same way since I already had screws running through the material, so for the long ones, I first thought about using the domino, then I realized it would be a lot easier with pocket holes, so that's what I went with instead. It almost always seems like there is a solution to all the problems that occur in woodworking. In fact, I think it's extremely rare when there is none. But if you've had some major ones, I would love to hear about them, and then I'll tell the world in the podcast I mentioned earlier. I'll call you out. I also attached the connecting pieces at the top with pocket holes, and after finishing one of the frames, I knew it was just a matter of rinse and repeat for the 2 other frames. Well, talking about problems, I did have one. A major one, I would say. In drawing up these tables, which I did really quickly the same morning I was going to get the materials, I forgot one thing. I didn't think about the overhang on the long sides of the tables. In fact, when placing the top on the first finished base, I realized that I'd made the base the exact same width as the tabletops. And I didn't like the look of that. And the only good solution I could come up with was to waste one of the tabletops. rip that into thinner pieces, and then glue up tabletops. Because all the table bases were already in glue. And the whole plan was not to have to do a glued up tabletop, but rather place the two tabletops on top of the base with a small gap in the middle. But that plan was ruined. I had to buy one more tabletop shelving piece. Unfortunately, I could only get my hands on one piece that was 1 millimeter thicker than the previous ones, close to home, so that's what I did. And that shelving piece was also a lot more expensive. So eventually I had to get the domino out anyways and started the glue up that would set me back in time and money. But anyways, doing the glue up took more time, but I figured it would still look good, if not better. Why am I trying to beat IKEA then? Well, there's nothing wrong with IKEA per se, and in this case they're kind of acting as the antagonist of big companies who manufacture and produce things that aren't meant for use over decades. I just recently visited a random clothing outlet. Basically, it looked like a graveyard for clothes that couldn't be sold and came here to hopefully get a home at a much lower cost than first intended. And it kind of makes me feel sick. There's so much production going on, so much waste of products that never get sold or will get sold, but won't last long at all. We're overexploiting the world to look nice or so that our homes can follow the latest trends. And the most absurd thing in this consumerism is that no one cares. I mean, no one cares what your home looks like. Make it for you and no one else. I'm not innocent in all of this by any means. I keep learning. I can't say how many toys I've bought my kids. Plastic crap. And they won't get much use. But if I get my kids a book, they'll read it or I'll read it to them multiple times. Things that last, I guess, is what I'm promoting here. I'm not sure how long these tables will last, but I will try to make sure they do for a long time, if I can get them made in time. But there was one problem. I was on a short deadline and the finish still hadn't shown up. So after sanding the tables, I had to put the build on hold for one entire day, setting me back a lot, but there was basically nothing else I could do. Now, I did mention some 3D prints for this project. Well, I think there's definitely room for using more of our tables, whether it be the coffee table or the dining table. There are some stuff that we always keep on the table. Some candles, matches, tissues, remote controls, stuff that would be better off hidden. Well, I drew up a simple under the table drawer, one for each table. It's such an easy way to gain some storage that won't really be visible. These were designed with a small tap so that you can't pull them all the way out, because it's always a hassle putting them back in. And I know I go on and on about 3D printing, but it's because I absolutely love the idea of being able to make my own things whenever I need them. But if you don't have a 3D printer, I have a great option for you, because the sponsor of today's video, PCBWay, not only manufacture PCBs and PCB assemblies, they also offer CNC milling and 3D printing. So whenever you find something you want to 3D print, you can upload the model to their website and have them make it and ship it to you. One of the tabletops had a couple of nuts in them, and rather than going with epoxy that takes ages to cure, I used one of my favorite things for filling small holes like this, and it's called Milliput, and it's a two-part dough that you can get in multiple colors, and you just mix it. You fill the void, wait a couple of hours, and then it's rock hard and you can sand it down. It's the perfect solution. The finish finally arrived, and I could finish both the tables with Rubio Monocoat Duro Grit Green. It's just a really good outdoor finish that will make sure these tables last a long time inside the barn. I applied it with a brush and that was it. The tables were done one day before our party, and we could focus on getting the last bits and pieces ready for the next day. The Observant Club might have seen that I made two of the tables with more overhang so that I could place all the tables in a row and have the two tables with overhang at the two ends to place people there as well. Now for the price, the tabletops ended up costing around 900 Swedish crowns, which is about 85 bucks per table. And all the wood, the construction wood for the rest of the tables, ended up at around 420 Swedish crowns, which is about 40 bucks. That gives us a total of about $125 per table, which isn't too bad considering it's a big table. In that price, I haven't included the finish though. So I used 1.5 0.5 liter cans of Rubio Monocoat Duro Grit. And that amounts to about $22 per table for the finish. So that would amount to about $150 per table. And to account for my mistake that made me have to buy a new tabletop, that gave me an additional cost of about $60. So all in all, a total cost of $525 and $175 per table. But without the mistakes, $147, which is fairly good. I would say it would be hard to find a table that size for that price that can handle outdoor weather. So out of curiosity, I checked IKEA's website for their current tables that could compare in size to mine. This one was about $700, so a lot more, but of course a bit more stylish perhaps than mine. But the top is made out of particle board and veneer. And whilst that will probably keep the finish and look for a good long time, it might not last that long. Or who knows. It can take a beating at least. The older I get, I just want my tables to be able to take a beating. Okay, so they also have cheaper alternatives, and the first one I found was around $660 that I would say looks really good, but we have the same problem or the same issue here. The legs are solid beech but with oak veneer, and the top is particle board with veneer. You can't smack that table. This is not as long as mine and basically the same width as mine. You can buy extensions for this, which is, yeah, it would make it longer, but then you're facing more money. The absolute closest I could come down in price on IKEA's website was this one, which is also the most similar one to mine because it's got a solid pine top. Kind of the same construction as mine, but I think it doesn't look as nice. And this one was a bit cheaper, $568, and that makes it a difference of $421 compared to mine. And in fact, I'm able to make all my 3 tables within that price, so there you go. You can make it cheaper than IKEA. But if you think you can beat me to it, get the price down even further, please challenge me. Now, I only calculated the cost of the wood and the finish. Of course, there are some other costs related to this, like some screws and glue, but that won't amount to too much in the grand scheme of it all. But if you challenge me, the only thing you need to think about is that you need to be able to give this wood a good whack. You know, a closed fist and some power to it. Am I still talking about tables? I love a challenge, so come on and get me.